So we'll move ahead to the next item which is the Green Themes presentation by Fred Cowles, who is from the Middle Grand River Organization of Watersheds, or MGRO. I believe that the first slide of his presentation is already on the screens there. So this is part of our Green Themes presentation, which is one of the Environmental Commission's functions, which is education of the public. So, Fred, thank you for coming, and thank you for your efforts to educate us.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I am Fred Cowles. I'm the president of the Middle Grand River Organization of Watersheds, which is a 501c3 charitable organization looking to foster education and good land use for the water quality in the Grand River. My background, a couple of degrees here and there, and a 30-year career with the state Water Pollution Control Agency, going through a number of changes over the years. Spent 10 years with a major consulting firm in Michigan. Now I'm mostly retired, but I do have my own consulting firm, Cowles Environmental, but leaves me a lot of time for volunteer work, which gets me into the MGRO realm. When I talk about green infrastructure, the motivation was a proposed development in Meridian Township that I submitted a letter on behalf of the organization, suggesting that green infrastructure be considered in that development, and indeed all developments or redevelopments in Meridian Township. And from that, I was invited to speak on green infrastructure, and so here I am. So what is green infrastructure? It's a subject that gets kind of wonky, and EPA came out with a definition that said that green infrastructure is an adaptable, multifunctional approach to stormwater management and climate resiliency with many benefits for communities. It improves water quality, conserves water, strengthens local economy, enhances community and infrastructure resiliency. You still don't know what it is. So EPA came out with a different definition. It says green infrastructure uses plants, soils, nature itself to manage stormwater and create healthier urban environments. Green infrastructure practices can be used to reduce the need for expensive gray infrastructure, pipes, storage facilities, and treatment systems, because plants and soil soak up, store, and use rainwater. Communities can also create or preserve existing vegetated areas to maintain high quality of life, and it goes on, kind of wonky stuff. American Rivers, a 501c3 national organization, defined green infrastructure as an approach to water management that protects, restores, or mimics the natural water cycle. Green infrastructure is effective, economical, and enhances community safety and quality of life. It's a little easier to understand, but you still don't really know what it is. So Wikipedia goes out and defines it with an even wonkier, long definition, and I'm not even going to bother reading it because you get lost in all that jargon and stuff. So people are understandably confused about what green infrastructure is. It's not surprising. And the thing to remember that it's a concept that nobody owns. Nobody can say that it is exactly this. It's a concept that is growing and evolving over time. And so don't worry about those particular definitions. You don't have to pick them apart. But in order to talk about it, let's put it in context. I'm a context kind of a guy. So what is a natural system anyway? One thing we have to realize that there are no natural systems in Michigan anymore. We have changed virtually everything in Michigan. The only way to get the natural environment back to Michigan is to move 10 million people somewhere else and then wait 300 years. And clearly we're not going to be doing that, but it still is instructive to talk about what that environment was 300 years ago. When the glaciers receded, the land was just bare ground, and there was a succession of plants going from grasses and sedges to shrubs to trees. And when the Europeans invaded this area in the 1700s, we had climax forests, oak, hickory, beech maple, and pine. And when it was that way, a squirrel could climb a tree on the shores of Lake Erie and jump from tree to tree until it got to Lake Michigan. We were, a climax forest area. When it rained, the raindrops never hit the ground. When it rained, the drops hit the tops of the trees. And if some of that water would evaporate, and if it kept raining, it would drip off of the leaves. And then it would hit the shrubs below. And there'd be some evaporation, and if it kept raining, the water would drop off of those leaves onto the ground cover. More evaporation and more dripping of the water down into the leaf litter. Now, if it kept raining, the water would go down into the soil. Once in the soil, there are all kinds of roots in the ground that will suck up the water and transpire it back to the atmosphere. If there was more rain than that, it would soak down and replenish the groundwater. The groundwater would slowly and steadily feed the cool, clean streams. The streams would feed rivers, and the rivers flowed cool and deep and narrow banks, and there'd seldom be flooding, except in the springtime when the soil was frozen and snow was melting. But European settlement changed all of that. We cleared off all the forests. There are a couple of remnants of first growth forests now in heartwood pines and a couple other little postage stamp size things. But we've wiped out all of those trees. We do have forests, of course, but they're second and third growth forests. The wetlands mostly were drained. They made way for agriculture, and drained swampland makes pretty good agriculture. But we really changed the terrain in Michigan. Along with clearing away all that land, people came in and they needed places to live. We built cities. And along with cities, we started to pave over things with roofs and sidewalks and streets and parking lots. And here we have the Meyer parking lot, not too far from here. You can see that when rain hits the ground here, it comes straight from the clouds and right onto the ground. And we have to have systems to get rid of that water now because it isn't happening the way it does naturally. So we have these catch basins that collect the water and move them off to our rivers and streams, and most of Meridian is in the Red Cedar watershed. So all this development fundamentally changed the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle. Things don't happen anymore naturally. Now the raindrop falls from the sky and it hits the earth, bare earth. And when it does that, there's a lot of energy that gets dissipated. That energy from the raindrop mobilizes the soil particles. Once the soil particles are mobilized, they flow to wherever the stormwater flows. Now, of course, that's always downhill. And with our drainage systems, we pipe it directly to the nearest stream. So as a result, the streams become flashy. They have low flows and high flows instead of slow and steady and cool. They warm up because that raindrop hitting the hot asphalt gets warm. Whereas in the natural system, it trickles down into the ground and stays cool. So we have more frequent floods now. The narrow, deep streams have become wide and shallow. The temperatures are higher, and that results in a reduced species diversity. The rain, when it hits the ground in that urban environment or the altered environment, picks up whatever we're doing on that land. Whether that's feces from pets and animals or from septic systems, whatever, whether that's phosphorus naturally or from fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, tire tread dust, brake pads that wear out. Anything we do on the land ends up on the ground, so when it rains, it gets picked up and transported to our rivers and streams. Cities and industries, of course, use those streams to get rid of their waste. So industrial waste and municipal waste were very commonly discharged to our rivers and streams. Much different than that natural environment. Things got real bad in the 50s and 60s. You're all aware of the environmental movement and burning rivers. The picture here is the Cuyahoga, but similar things happened in the Rouge River and the Chicago River. That, and among a number of other issues related to our misuse of the environment, led to the Clean Water Act in 1972. And indeed a number of other environmental laws. But the Clean Water Act probably is the most effective federal legislation of all time. It changed the world we live in America. The Clean Water Act had noble goals of solving all the water pollution problems by 1977. And of course that didn't happen, but a lot of things did happen. Most industries actually met that deadline. Most of the cities complied with the Clean Water Act requirements by about 1988. Combined sewer overflows were not originally controlled by the Clean Water Act, but lawsuits and other things happened so that now combined sewer overflows are largely controlled. There's still many issues yet to go, but far better than what it was in the 60s. More exotic pollutants like DDT and mercury and PCBs have been addressed, and their concentrations in our environment are going down dramatically. Not as good as we'd like it, of course, but much better than it had been. And we seem to be learning about new pollutants of emerging concern all the time. I'm sure you've heard the word PFAS lately, but there are many others, the nanoparticles and other things, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and there's just a ton of other things that are coming down the pike that the Clean Water Act is mostly capable of addressing. We still have problems, though. I mentioned the pollutants of emerging concern that seem to keep popping up. Agricultural pollution was exempted from the Clean Water Act, and so many of the agricultural uses are still unregulated, and that's a very controversial topic, and I don't see anything changing in that regard in the near future. Municipal stormwater impacts remain, although municipal stormwater is partially regulated. Meridian Township has a discharge permit for its stormwater. And so there's some regulation on that. Ingham County is a partner with the township in controlling the stormwater in the township. But that's only partially successful. The picture is of a dumpster on the banks of the Red Cedar River, not too terribly far from here. This is a relatively current picture. I'm sure you could go out today and find a similar thing. We have work to do. Agricultural drainage is unregulated, and again, I don't see that changing anytime soon, but that is a significant impact on our waters because it takes the rainfall and moves it quickly into the stream instead of, under the natural situation, it was moved slowly into the stream. So, what does all that history have to do with green infrastructure? Traditional thinking would say that all of us have to get together and build more gray infrastructure to handle these pollution sources. Let's build things with concrete and steel and use electricity and chemicals and solve those pollution problems. If that's even possible, it would be extremely expensive and be, devastating to the economy and our way of life. But it's probably not even possible, even if we had unlimited funds to deal with it. So advocates of green infrastructure claim that a new paradigm is needed that learns from nature and mimics the natural environment as much as we can without moving 10 million people out of Michigan. Green infrastructure does not replace the gray infrastructure. The steel and concrete and chemicals and electricity and stuff will still be needed to deal with our drainage. But green infrastructure can assist in a wide variety of ways, including reducing the cost of adequately handling our stormwater. So green infrastructure is multiple systems and practices that use or mimic natural processes to infiltrate, transpirate, and reuse stormwater at sites of development and redevelopment. So it's no one thing. It's any of a variety of things that will slow down the movement of water, spread it out, and let it soak into the ground. By doing that, we're learning from nature and trying to do what nature used to do. Green infrastructure can be at different scales, from a residential property with a little rain garden to community-wide requirements and subdivision or industrial park size devices that use the green infrastructure concept. Again, that's slow down the stormwater, spread it out, and soak it in. Some people include land preservation and restoration of the natural landscape as part of green infrastructure. People are of mixed minds on whether that's included in the name of green infrastructure or not. I don't care if it is or not. But land preservation certainly does help preserve and utilize the natural forces. So I said the basic concept is slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. And when you do that, green things grow. And if we choose what those green things are, we can even be more effective than just letting whatever happens happen. The basic adage is trees are good. It's what we used to have, and the more trees we have, the better off we're going to be. But we can't have trees everywhere. We need to also use shrubs and grasses and sedges and sedums and other things that are green to help control the stormwater. Stormwater can be and should be integrated with other things that are happening in the community, whether it's parks and open space or parking lots or a climate adaptation strategy, smart growth, flood mitigation, all the things that government often deals with and should be dealing with. Green infrastructure can be a part of it to help properly deal with the issues that we face. So what are those types of systems and practices? I'll go through quite a number of them here kind of quick, just so you have an understanding of the kinds of things we're talking about. Let's start with a green roof. A green roof can be anything that's a plant that has chlorophyll, from sedums that are just an inch or two high to full-grown trees. And the structure of the building has to be compatible to hold that weight, but a properly designed building should be able to do that. And the result is that it slows down the flow of stormwater and it cleanses it. It doesn't have it soak in, because you don't want it to soak into your building, but it has the benefits of having that green space up on the roof. So it helps clean the air, it reduces carbon dioxide, it reduces the heat island effect, because the roof is cooler because of the green plants that transpire, creating the cooling effect. Many roofs can be retrofitted to have the green roof. But on new buildings, the green roof can be designed as a part of the amenities for the occupants of the building. You can actually make a park-like setting on the roof of buildings. It can be used for barbecues or sunbathing, or just a place to sit and get out of the hustle bustle of the city in a green environment. It's good for mental health, just to get out of your normal activities and be surrounded by things that are growing. Planter boxes. These are ones in downtown Lansing. It's very similar to a rain garden, except that planter boxes have a bottom. They don't infiltrate into the ground. But the other functions of a rain garden are there. The water goes in when it rains, soaks through the soil, the plants take up some of that water, transpire, and the water that comes out the bottom through an under drain is cleansed, and it goes out more slowly than it would under traditional infrastructure, where it just goes into the catch basin and directly out to the stream. These planter boxes in Lansing are really a community amenity. It just makes walking down the street nicer when you have something green instead of just concrete. It's a pleasant thing to have. I mentioned rain gardens. The one on the right happens to be in Grand Rapids at the West Michigan Environmental Action Council's backyard. And the design is sort of a generalized design. Rain gardens can be designed in a wide variety of ways, but the idea, again, is to collect that storm water, slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. So many rain gardens will have an under drain that goes into the traditional infrastructure. But when it does, it's at least cleansed and slowed down. But it does allow for recharge of the groundwater. Many people use rain gardens for pollinators or butterfly gardens, but it doesn't have to be native plants and stuff, although that's certainly a good idea. It can be any kind of plant. It can be your cultivars as well. And so they can be made very attractive. A bioswale or bioretention cell is essentially a rain garden on steroids. The only difference is that the jargon term bioretention cell makes it a larger system, usually with more design features for operation and maintenance and long-term functioning. So if you're building a rain garden for, say, Meridian Mall, we call it a bioretention cell just because of scale. Vegetated swales or tree trenches, again, it's a variation on the theme. It's like a rain garden, except that the water is moving from one place to another. So instead of having the storm water come off of a parking lot or something into a catch basin and go with a pipe to the stream, it goes into this vegetated swale, this little ditch that has plants in it that the water would flow through, so that the water has a chance to come into contact with the plants. The plants take up much of that water and filter out what passes by. Many of the vegetated swales allow the water to migrate into the groundwater. That sometimes is not advantageous because there are issues with groundwater, but where it is appropriate, then you're getting some groundwater recharge from these as well. Tree trenches can be tricky because trees need soil for their roots. You don't see the roots, but the trees need room underground for their roots. Some designs have included tree trenches that just didn't allow enough room for the tree roots, and the trees died. And so some people have the idea that, oh, these things don't work. Designed correctly, they will work, but we have to avoid the design pitfalls. Ponds. Stormwater ponds have been a requirement for, I don't know, about 30 years, on and off, depending on where you are. But the criteria for their design was simply flow control. Don't flood out your neighbor. That was the only reason that stormwater detention ponds were required. So some of our ordinances still only require that, but ordinances may be changed to require more than that. But even if the ordinance doesn't change, I think we can encourage designers to think about green infrastructure as a part of their pond design, so that the ponds will have perhaps a forebay so that the heavy sediment gets separated out before it hits the rest of the pond. The bottom of the pond is of a material that allows for infiltration into the ground, and plant species are selected to help with the treatment of the water and to transpire some of that water. So again, a pond in the old days was just a rectangular body that had water when it rained, and then it drained out after the rain just to control the peak flow rates. Nowadays, we should be looking at ponds to do a lot more than just that. Porous pavement. Although it's not green, it's considered part of the green infrastructure just because where else are you going to put it? But it does slow down the movement of water, spreads it out, and lets it soak in. Now, porous pavement can have its pitfalls as well. Sometimes the soils below the parking lot or wherever you have your porous pavement can't accept all the water. Clay soils just don't take it, so you have to include an overflow or an underdrain into your gray infrastructure. But where the soils do accept it, you reduce that amount of water considerably using the porous pavement. I've seen this demonstration where you take a bucket of water and pour it on the porous pavement, and it just goes away. Of course, it doesn't soak into the ground that fast, but it does get below the surface so that it doesn't warm up like it would on in a puddle on a traditional parking lot. And it may be underdrained or not underdrained depending on your native soil conditions. There's a concept called green streets or complete streets that I'm pretty sure you've talked about at some point in time. The idea is to make streets something that is not exclusively for the automobile. Streets are good for pedestrians and bicyclists, and so a green street makes it more friendly for people to walk and bike, and it can also be used as stormwater management. So it's making the area more pleasant for people who live there, and does a better job of protecting our water resources. Wetlands and riparian areas, certainly where they exist, they should be protected, but there are many places that are creating artificial wetlands for the purpose of managing stormwater. The top right is not far from here, Okemos High School. Middle one is in Inkster, and the one on the left is Lansing Tollgate, not very far from here. The idea is to use the green areas of a wetland, again, to capture the stormwater, slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. It also creates, like at the toll gate in Lansing, nice pedestrian paths around it. Makes a very nice community amenity. When I'm out there, I always see other people out there too, enjoying just a walk around the greenery. Rainwater harvesting, again, that isn't green, but we don't know quite where else to put it. It doesn't soak anything in really, but it does capture and slows down the flow of that storm water. Again, it can be at multiple scales. In the center, it's just a rain barrel from our residential property. One property might have 4 or 5 rain barrels to capture the roof drainage and then use that water for irrigating the flowers after the rain. But it can be upscaled as well. The one on the left is Fairlane Mall in Allen Park. I think that's a Target store if I remember right. And they capture all the roof water and actually use it for flushing toilets and watering the landscape at the mall. But it can be used also in more residential areas and be a little less obvious. The cistern can be underground, so you don't even know it's there. But again, it captures the stormwater, slows it down, and uses it for some other purpose. So the value of all these things is, of course, stormwater management. That's kind of the thing that got me here today. But the idea of green infrastructure not only manages stormwater, but it helps with climate adaptation, the heat island effect, biodiversity, air quality, water, soils, recreation, and all boiling down to the quality of life. I think by incorporating green infrastructure into the things that government does, both in terms of what is built by the township and what the township allows others to build, helps create a sense of community and improving the quality of life for the citizens. So how do you implement this stuff? Well, essentially 2 things. You can do it by ordinance and force people to do it, or you can do it by incentives and education. And some blend of those 2 will probably be what everybody does. By including green infrastructure in the concepts of regional stormwater management planning and including it in low impact development requirements, stormwater ordinances, planning and zoning, all of these things, promoting a tree canopy. Many communities have their own forester that helps with the city-owned trees, but also residents managing their trees. Like I said before, trees good. Let's keep our trees. They're nice to have around. And they certainly help with stormwater management. Stormwater utility fee is something that isn't used in Michigan very much, probably for good reason, after the city of Lansing tried to do it and got set back by the Supreme Court. But there is a bill soon to be introduced in the legislature that will spell out in more detail how a community might have a stormwater utility and meet the requirements of the Supreme Court. Many other states, the stormwater fee structure is a standard thing. Everybody's doing it. So that's about all I have to say. I just want to say a little something about MGROW. Our purpose is to protect and preserve the history and natural resources of the Middle Grand River watershed by promoting education, that's why I'm here tonight, conservation, restoration, and wise use of our watershed resources. You're probably familiar with the Pollution Isn't Pretty program that we helped create. We've put together a water trail for the Middle Grand River. Our water trail plan is about to be complete. It includes a provision for adding the Red Cedar, Looking Glass, and Maple rivers at some future time. We've been in discussions with Williamston and Williamstown Township about including the Red Cedar River as a water trail. The Middle Grand and the Upper Grand are DNR designated water trails today. The lower is working on theirs. And so we'd love to have Meridian join Williamstown and Williamston and East Lansing, MSU, and City of Lansing in creating a water trail for the Red Cedar. With that, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Well, you mentioned the water trail in Meridian Township maybe getting involved. What would that involve? If the township got involved, what would we do?
Well, you currently have an access site at name of the park, not Wanch, across the street from Wanch. Ferguson Park. So we'd expect that would be maintained and continued, perhaps improved. There are some things that could be done to improve access at that site. There may be other places where access would be useful and appropriate. So we'd explore those ideas. But and it would be up for the township to decide how you wanted to promote the use of that. By having it a part of the area-wide water trail, when you seek grants for site improvements, they usually get a higher priority when it's a part of a regional plan. So that's where we can come in and help with priority for grants you might be seeking for improvements at water trail sites.
Other questions?
I was intrigued by a couple of statements you made, and then I have a question. I was intrigued by your use of the word, the Europeans invaded. Somehow I think maybe settlers came. I'm not sure it was an active invasion, but yes, I guess it was. And whether or not 300 years would work to get back, I think what we've got here, it'll take a lot more than 300 years of just moving out without actually improving. My question as an urban forester, could you describe the tree trench concept?
Well, essentially it's the same as a rain garden, except you have trees. And so you need to make sure there is adequate soil for the root mass. But the idea is exactly the same, to receive the runoff have it soak into the soil to feed the tree, and the tree will transpire some of that water, and other parts of the rainfall will enter the groundwater or need to be drained off into gray infrastructure.
Yeah. So it's more a structure, you know, like City of Lansing, East Lansing, MSU campus. There are a lot of street trees that are planted along streets, but you're going a little step beyond just planting it on the planting trees on the surface. You're kind of
Well,
planting trees in an open sewer.
Well, I wouldn't call it that.
No, not a sewer,
Yeah,
but a
the tree
drainage.
trench could be above ground if that's appropriate, or underground, so you wouldn't even know it's there by looking at it. But it would be called a tree trench because of the structural needs for the adjacent land uses.
Okay.
Whether it's a parking lot or a building or something else that needs the walls under there to protect it from soil subsidence and other things.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere in Michigan where we could look at this porous pavement, and how does it hold up with our freeze-thaw?
Good question.
There are quite a few places in Michigan. I can't give you a list right now, but there are plenty. And how does it hold up? It's a mixed bag. There have been some significant failures, and that has caused implementation of porous pavement to be a little slow because there have been problems. But there have been major successes as well. So the trick is largely in the installation. The contractor needs to be specially trained in porous pavement and have some experience with it. Then it can be very successful. And with regard to freeze-thaw, the critical part of that is the sub-base of the pavement. So the porous pavement itself is only 3 to 5 inches thick, and below that it has to have enough volume for the water to get the water out of the pavement itself. Once water remains in that pavement and freezes, it's going to be torn apart. So the design needs to include some provision to make sure that the water cannot reach the pavement itself. So you need some under drain type facility in there to make sure that doesn't happen, because the freeze-thaw will just tear it apart. But the good thing is that in the winter time, the snow will come down and it will melt and just go right through. So you need less snow plowing on a porous pavement than you would on a traditional pavement. Porous pavement, one of the largest installations is at Ford in Dearborn. They have a huge parking lot that's porous pavement, and they're running new vehicles and pickup trucks over it all the time, and it's holding up quite well. But there are many around. There are essentially 3 kinds of porous pavement. There's porous concrete, porous asphalt, and blocks, where like a brick or other kind of block that allows water to flow in between them. And so these pavers, we call them, have an advantage over the other in that you can tear it up, do some utility repair, and put it back. But the porous concrete and porous asphalt, you can't do that.
I think one of the closest examples is at the salvage yard at MSU. Part of that parking lot, fact is, when I tried to park there, I wasn't allowed to because I didn't have an electric vehicle. But it's porous and restricted for electric vehicles. There's also, near Wharton Center, there's some rubberized pavement that would be porous. It's along between Owen Hall and Wharton Center. You could walk along the edge of the woods, and you're on rubber sidewalk, which is also porous.
And then the research complex at
Where?
that research complex at MSU, off of, behind the clinical center.
Okay, that has,
That's all porous pavement. And it works amazingly well. I mean, it's amazing. The parking areas are porous pavements, the areas where you drive on are not, and it's just amazing the difference in amount of water on them. And basically, the porous pavement drains the center area for the drive.
The critique I've heard about porous pavement, though, is that it's not nearly as tolerant of heavy vehicles, so that it gets crushed.
Yeah, and that's why at MSU, the main driveways on the research complex
Right,
are not porous pavement, those are regular pavement, and the parking areas are porous pavement.
Right,
The other thing is they also have to be vacuumed,
right.
and if they're not, then they clog. And I can also I won't tell you, but I can later tell you where it doesn't work because they didn't
Because they didn't
maintain.
vacuum
They
it?
didn't maintain. Mhm.
Uh-huh. Okay.
There was one place that was demonstrating porous pavement at a conference that I attended, and they had they had two areas that had porous pavement. One, they didn't bother to tell the landscapers about it, and the landscapers came in with some wood chips and piled them up on the porous pavement and just totally plugged it up. And in one quick move, they just destroyed the functionality of it. The other one that wasn't piled with wood chips was working just fine.
It's a topic that's come up many times, and there are lots of people who are interested in, if they're repaving their driveway or whatever, if they could have porous pavement, but then all these questions come up, and I feel as though as a commission, I wish we had more definitive answers, solutions to those problems, so people could go ahead and pursue those urges. For instance, what are cost comparisons? How bad is it if you kind of miss your 6-month vacuuming or whatever? Just sort of some real demonstrations, some real practical illustrations where people can learn. I'm kind of in the same way that John knows where to point people if they're curious about solar panels and how those are serving.
Yeah, there are many people that are looking at that very issue, and the trouble is, the answer is not clear. I mean, depending on so many different variables, some things you just don't predict the outcome. If the contractor just didn't do it right, then it can be a failure, and it'll be hard to determine that was in fact the cause. So it's a complex issue, but there are people looking at that pretty closely.
Mm-hmm. I had another question about you were talking about capturing rainwater from roofs and so forth. And of course, roof shingles are also made of tarry material with gravel on birdstone or whatever you call that stuff. And do we know anything about, for example, polyaromatic hydrocarbons that end up in that kind of runoff?
Yes. But again, that's an area that is still controversial among the geeks. The United States Geological Survey has been on a big kick, I guess, to get rid of PAHs from things like the shingles and coal tar applications on asphalt. And their work shows pretty clearly that the PAHs do move from the asphalt or the shingles in the stormwater and in the air. The particles get into the dust, and they found that children and pets will bring that dust into the house, so you can find PAHs in your carpet as a result of what was on your roof. And it's kind of stark. What they haven't shown to my satisfaction is how dangerous that is. The levels of the PAHs, while they're detectable, I'm not sure that they're really to the level of a public health concern. It may or may not be. The reports that I've read on that just didn't quite convince me that this is a stand up and protest type issue. Prudence would say, yeah, we should limit our contact with any of these potentially carcinogenic substances. So I certainly agree that minimizing our contact is a good thing, but whether that's a real public health issue at present time, I'm not sure.
One other question. So it's, for many people, the idea of a park, of a green space, is a lawn. You didn't say anything about lawns as effective water absorbers or failed water absorbers. Of course, lawns are sort of ecological deserts, and I ride my bicycle around here and I see acres and acres of lawn, and I'm curious about whether there are communities that have successfully sort of adapted or just developed cultures that recognize that. Well, I'm obviously showing my bias, that the ecological undesirability of having lots of lawn.
Yeah, I think it's indisputable that lawns are not great for stormwater management, but they're better than concrete.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't want to diss lawns totally, but certainly having something with a deeper root structure would help, slow down, spread out, and soak in the stormwater. So the idea of having prairie grasses that might be, 3-5 feet tall would be better than the 2-inch bluegrass. Many ordinances, I'm not sure what Meridian's is, require that the grass be no longer than 3 inches.
Right.
And so it is an impediment to people who want to put in something more ecological. I know in Ann Arbor, they've, I'm not sure how they did, I didn't look at the ordinance, but they have some exemption for rain gardens and plantings that will allow for taller grasses. And there are probably many other communities around as well. But it's certainly an issue that hasn't gone unnoticed.
That's it. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Fred.
you.
That was enlightening. And just in case people didn't notice, MGROW has a website, which is the most obvious thing, www.mgrow.org, in case people want to learn more about the organization and what it can teach us.